Axios reports that during a classified briefing with senators on Tuesday, Joint Chiefs Chairman Mark Milley blamed the State Department for a slow civilian evacuation from Afghanistan, saying, quote, officials waited too long. The private remarks come amid Milley's public testimony this week, in which his various responses to the botched evacuation underscore the divisions between the State Department and the Pentagon. Here's Congressman Matt Gaetz questioning Milley on his previous statements that the Taliban would not defeat the government of Afghanistan immediately. Let's see his response.
February 26, 2020, House Armed Services Committee, General Mark Milley. We know we're not going to defeat the Taliban militarily, and they're not going to defeat the government of Afghanistan militarily. You really blew that call, didn't you, General?
I believe that that was a issue of strategic stalemate, and that if we had remained in Afghanistan with the advisory levels of effort, then the government of Afghanistan...
Well, that's an interesting answer to a question. It's just not one I asked. You spent more time with Bob Woodward on this book than you spent analyzing the very likely prospect that the Afghanistan government was going to fall immediately to the Taliban, didn't you?
Not even close, Congressman.
Oh, really? Because you said right after Kabul fell that no one could have anticipated the immediate fall of the Ghani government. When did you become aware that Joe Biden tried to get Ghani to lie about the conditions in Afghanistan? He did that in July. Did you know that right away?
I'm not aware of what President Biden...
You're not aware of the phone call that Biden had with Ghani where he said, whether it is true or not, we want you to go out there and paint a rosy picture of what's going on in Afghanistan. You're the chief military advisor to the president. You said that the Taliban was not going to defeat the government of Afghanistan militarily, which, by the way, they cut through them like a hot knife through butter. And then the president tries to get Ghani to lie. When did you become aware of that attempt?
Well, there's two things there, Congressman, if I may. One is what I said was the situation was stalemate, and if we kept advisors with there, the government of Afghanistan and the Army would have still been there. That's what I said.
Defense Priorities senior fellow and military expert Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis responded to this week's testimony saying, quote, congressional hearings in the Senate and House on the war in Afghanistan make one point painfully clear. Withdrawing all U.S. troops by the August 31st deadline was the right policy. Afghanistan and Iraq war veteran Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis joins us now to weigh in. Welcome, Lieutenant Colonel.
Thanks for having me.
So it was interesting in this hearing to continuously see this caveat from military leaders who kept saying, oh, well, the Afghan government could survive, yes, as long as we continued propping it up with troops and money. That's a caveat that seemed to be missing from previous testimony when the generals were advocating for continued support, saying that they were going to be able to stand up on their own. What did you make of this latest kind of rationale from generals?
Yeah, that frankly, it's not credible because the decision had already been made that the United States was going to withdraw our troops at that time. So you can't say that, well, I said that with the assumption that we would continue on, because that assumption didn't exist. We knew we weren't going to leave. So if you said that then the assumption should be that they can do it on their own. But it's even worse than that, because on July 21st, so literally just 2 weeks before the collapse began, the final collapse, Milley said, hey, the Afghan government and military has the full capacity to continue to defend their country. And then it was about 10, 12 days later, then he makes the infamous statement that no one could have foreseen this coming, and so many people saw this coming. Actually, many people saw this coming. And for him to continually say that he didn't see this and to make statements like he has and then tried to blame the State Department, as he did in other testimony, smacks to me of someone who is not accepting any responsibility for his actions and wants others to be held accountable.
That was going to be exactly what I was going to ask about here, is that did Milley believe what he was saying, which if that was the case, it would speak to, I think, an immense failure of our intelligence services. Or, as we saw many times with the Afghanistan papers, was he utterly misleading the public? Which is it, do you think, when it comes to Milley?
Yeah, it's not a failure of intelligence. The intelligence has been out there actually in many an open source case. Forget about the classified assessments. It's been out there in the open that this was, likely to happen, that it was going to come, whether it was going to be within 10 days or whether it was going to be a few months after. You can quibble about the time frame, but the statements were out there. What is the problem, however, is that you have not just in this current environment where the senior military leaders are either dissembling or they're outright deceiving the American public. This has been going on for more than a decade, as I've chronicled in many places, going all the way back to 2010. And so you can't say now that we didn't know or anything. When I was on the ground in 2011 and I wrote about it in 2012, that this was disaster, that the military leaders were not being honest with that. Then you had the Afghan papers that just deepened that explanation and details under how that was happening, how they were lying. And then you have it on, painful display, the consequences of all that. And I think that the Congress needs to really examine that, not just with General Milley, but across the board of the senior military leadership for the past decade. That's the real problem and why we lost this war the way we did.
Do you think it's still true that they were caught off guard by the speed with which the Taliban was able to take over? Like, is that where they may have actually been, there may have been an intelligence failure, there may have just been a total ignorance of the situation?
I think there was an unwillingness to believe that it could have happened. I think that they looked at the array of forces, they saw where people were, where the Afghan units were, and they just assumed that they would fight to the death and slowly be brought to, to a cobble where it would end in 3 to 6 months. I think that's what they thought that they shouldn't have, because again, in 2011, I warned that the Afghan military was already making deals with the Taliban then. So this has been something going on for a long time. And so it should have at least been in their range of possibilities that you would have this massive collapse, because the issue that what the generals should have contemplated and could have understood is that up to 6 months before this collapse fell, the Afghan military in many cases weren't getting paid at all. Now, that's a question also, because we were given money month after month, but it was never making it down to the soldiers. And of course, if you're not getting paid, you see your government leaving, they're corrupt. Why would you fight to the death again for that?
Right.
And from a moral and from an ethical perspective, isn't the scenario that you laid out that they were hoping would unfold, that they'd fight to the death for 3 to 6 months and then collapse, isn't that even more damning? Because then you have all of these thousands of people dying merely to postpone the reckoning by 3 to 6 months, dying essentially for their own reputations.
Well, and see, and this is why I've been saying this literally for years, almost all the way through since 2012, is that these senior officers and defense officials and civilians in some cases, and the presidents, we can't let them off the hook either. They knew that this could not be won militarily. They knew that. And instead of making the rational decision to bring this to a professionally conducted withdrawal and end it in something close to being given the Afghan government a chance, Biden didn't do it well, but his decision to get out was 100% the right thing and should have been done years ahead of time so that we could have avoided this chance, or at least given them a possibility of making it.
Yeah, that's well said. Lieutenant Colonel, you recently wrote that a war between the U.S. and China is coming without major and sustained change in how Washington forms policies in the Indo-Pacific region. On Twitter, you said, quote, "There's a dangerous idea in D.C. that we can choose to fight and win a war with China over Taiwan." I think that is increasingly clear. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, absolutely. There is this belief that we can literally do whatever we want and that there will never be a consequence. This is actually a part of the whole deception issue from the senior leadership, because they keep telling us that we can. And I'm telling you, from a military perspective, we can't. Because you look at the array of forces, don't look at the national forces, look at the forces that are available tactically in the East China Sea area, in the Indo-Pacific area, and China, who would be fighting about 100 miles off its shore, has a lot more forces than we do, fighting from about 6,000 miles away. And when you look at the A2AD, so-called, their defensive capabilities and our offensive capabilities, they can strike us from so much further away from the protection of their homeland. And just tactically, we probably could not win because we just don't have the forces to sustain it. But the big danger, as I point out in that article, is that it could go nuclear. Because if we start striking their homeland, which they vow is an inviolable attack on their country, then there's no reason to think they wouldn't attack our homeland, because they have the capacity to do that. And that's why we should simply not get into a situation where we could sacrifice American cities for something that we couldn't hold, even if we somehow did win.
Right. And can you game it out tactically? I mean, what kind of assets does the United States have in that region? We're talking about what, submarines and ships, neither of which sound like they're going to be able to carry the day in today's environment.
Right. We have a certain number at bases in the area as well as on patrol throughout there. We have some aircraft carrier groups. We have some other naval power subsurface capabilities and certainly air power that we have throughout that region. But in comparison to what the Chinese have, it's minuscule, frankly, especially in what could be brought to bear around the Taiwan Strait area. Everything is right there in their front yard, whereas we would have this long, thousands of miles logistic trail that could be interdicted all along the way. You simply can't fight that. It's just not a fair fight.
Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis, thank you so much for your perspective.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Much appreciated. We'll be back with more Rising after this.